much. Let's do this.
We've sure come a long way, haven't we? Hello. Today we're gonna talk about graphics. Every gaming generation a new console comes out and the graphics are improved. I've been real concerned about something, and surprisingly, I never really thought about it until recently. As we all know, every new generation, the main change in our gaming experience is graphics. That made me think of something. Just how much more can graphics really be improved? I know that graphics plays a key role in new gaming generations, but what happens when the graphics really can't get any better? It was easy when we changed bits every generation, since when referring to bits, the companies weren't really talking about bits from a technical standpoint, but simply things like faster speed, more colors, and more objects on the screen. Now a lot of times in this gaming generation you hear that graphics doesn't make the game, but gameplay does. This is very true. However, back in the day the companies had us believe that graphics not only made the game, but the console as well. This wasn't a problem back then, since while we thought graphics of the Sega and Super Nintendo were the best, something new would come along and say, not today you aren't. But what happens when that's no longer the main point of a console? Well, Nintendo proved that people are still willing to play games with graphics of not only last gen, but gens prior. However, can Sony and Microsoft do this as well? Now you're probably wondering why would they even have to? Well, here's where things get interesting. While the Atari wasn't the first gaming console, we can all at least agree it was the first true successful one. And as we also know, graphics weren't necessarily a strong point. But during that time, graphics weren't really that important of an aspect to a game, because graphics wasn't really being advertised. That is until the NES came along and showed us that with better graphics comes better gameplay. That is because with better graphics you can allow games to play a certain way that you couldn't before. And it worked out well. With the success of the 8-bit consoles came the success of the 16-bit consoles for the same reason. Then the 32-bit consoles, then the 64-bits. But then we ended up with a problem. Once we hit the 6th gaming generation, gameplay stopped changing for a lot of games, and in turn, we ended up with the same thing, but prettier graphics. Then when the 7th generation hit, the pattern repeated itself. Now with our current generation, we have online gaming as the main attraction. Without the online gaming, it would be the same as last gen. I'm not talking about the extra features that this gen's consoles came with. Nintendo may have been the first company to realize this, which may be why instead of the typical better graphics approach taken by Sony and Microsoft, they instead went with motion controls. They may have realized that without motion controls, all of their games would have ended up being the same, with better visuals. Prior to this gaming gen, a new console simply doubled its bits, but now it's a little more complicated than that. This is because before, when a console would double its bits, you didn't have to buy anything new. What do I mean by this? As you may know, most HD TV resolutions max out at 1080p. But if Sony has already reached the max of a HD TV, how can game visuals be improved? It's not like they can simply double the pixels count and say that next gen, PlayStation 4, will be running at 2160p or 4K as it is rumored. Yes, there are some HD TVs that can run at 2160p or 4K, but who's willing to buy a new screen, let alone one that expensive? But let's say for the sake of argument we do. Will more pixels be enough to get us to buy it? And if they simply release the next console with the same resolution, can they find a way to change the gameplay enough to get people to buy it? 2 of the 4 gaming hardware this gen have the same problem. First, take the PC. It doesn't have to worry about this gen and next gen because its games and hardware aren't advertised the same way. The Nintendo Wii has to get out a jail-free card for this since it has changed its reputation from new graphics to new gameplay. Very smart move in my opinion. Why? Because this means that if next gen, Nintendo comes out with a console that has 1080p, people will be amazed. Yes, it's already been done before, but for Nintendo, a company that changed from graphics to gameplay, to do this gives them an edge. But where does that leave Sony and Microsoft next gen? Now Microsoft can't really do what Nintendo can and start making games in 1080p, since it's part of the HD graphics group. To simply go from 720 to 1080p wouldn't be enough to please most people and get them to buy a whole new console. And since we haven't really heard much news from them since the advertisements for Kinect, that makes me wonder just what they plan to do for next gen. We know that the Xbox days are ending, and that Microsoft will need something new. But is the same console games that have 360 more pixels added to it really enough for next gen? Could it possibly be that we're starting to reach our limits on graphics? Now with Sony it gets a bit more interesting. As I said before, they've pretty much maxed out the graphic capability of a HD TV. However, could this have been their plan all along? Could Sony have done this so they didn't have to worry about it in the future? In other words, Sony may actually not need to make another PlayStation for the next generation, as past rumors may have been suggesting, since PS3 owners won't have to worry about buying a new console for 1080p. This would give Sony the edge over Microsoft and even Nintendo, since they won't have to buy a new console for 1080p games, since they already have it. But that only covers the graphics. How will Sony cover next generation gameplay? Or is it possible that they had that covered with the Move? Perhaps they believe if Nintendo can do it, maybe they can do it too. But remember, Sony is not known for motion controls like Nintendo is. Not only that, but with motion controls having the reputation of casual, does Sony really want to risk getting that title? Then there's the whole 3D gaming Sony is trying out. But I'm not sure that's going to turn out to be successful since that too requires a new TV. So there's no telling which way Sony will go next gen. So with Nintendo having a get out of jail free card and the PC getting a free ride, this puts a lot of pressure on Sony and especially Microsoft. It seems that when graphics became the most important aspect of a console with the generation we're in now, that console runs the risk of not being able to really upgrade due to graphics almost reaching its limit. Does this mean that the two HD consoles we have can no longer rely on better graphics alone, but instead have to add to its gameplay features in order to keep their gaming audience? And if so, how can they do this? Was it possible that people's obsession with graphics could cause another gaming crash? A little far-fetched, I know. But if there are people out there that are only concerned with the games being 1080p this gen, will they still game if the next generation offers them the exact same thing? This topic has too many different possibilities. I'm going to need you to help on this one, because this is something I simply have no answer for. There's too many different risks involved with these companies to just simply give us the same games, with higher resolutions next gen. Yes, they can make things look more realistic, but not everyone likes that. Realistic doesn't work for all games. When you use realism in a game, you have to follow the rules of real life. And let's face it, real life can be very boring, which is why we play games to begin with. Anyway, I'd like to know what you think about this one. When it comes to next generation, what can we really expect? Or is there simply something I overlooked?
Job complete. Well done.